Thank you. So once again, I'm Kelly Askew, and I'm serving as one of the discussants. Our second one is Patty Scannell, who I'll introduce shortly. And I'd like to say that in her insightful paper, I found Professor Bernal interrogates the assumptions so many of us hold with regard to the internet and employs evidence from Eritrea, from the Eritrean diaspora, to challenge them. Commonplace understandings about the internet as primarily an information portal and a tool for corporations to sell their products emerge, she argues, from Western middle-class experience of the internet, an experience that is culturally, socioeconomically, and geographically constrained and not generalizable to the world at large. By contrast, she poses a more Habermasian perspective for the data from Africa that understands the internet as an alternative public sphere to that created and controlled by the state. Egypt's Facebook revolution, and broader speaking the Arab Spring, is but the most widely circulated example of this. And while, yes, the internet does allow for the sharing and gathering of information by Africans, both in Africa and in the diaspora, and while it does serve the powerful within African consumer society as well, more importantly for the Eritreans she encounters online, it serves as a means of projecting and indeed enacting the kind of democratic nation-state that they wish Eritrea would become. Not merely challenging the state, though indeed they do this as well, but assuming responsibilities that states elsewhere would accept as part of their mandate. Eritrean diasporans in the U.S. employ the internet to distinctly political purposes. Through her case study, Professor Bernal invites reflection on commonly held ideas about the internet as primarily serving consumer and informational agendas, and reveals it to be the variegated cultural, geographic, socioeconomic, and political product that it is, not a uniform and universalizable technological form. A key concept that I think is worth pursuing and worth holding on to that she introduces is that of infopolitics, namely the way power is exercised and expressed through communication and through control over media. Eritrean diasporan websites that call the Eritrean government to task for lack of transparency and accountability to its people not only criticize, but seek to fill the gap when possible and serve a public need that she argues would ordinarily be fulfilled by a Western democratic government. The example provided is the acknowledgement and memorialization of those who sacrificed their lives for the nation during the border war with Ethiopia. Whereas the martyrs of the Eritrean War for Independence received due respects from the government, there has been a disturbing silence on the part of the government with regard to the dead from the border war, a silence that Eritreans in diaspora clearly find unconscionable. Hence, through leaking presumably government-collected data on who died and when, the webmasters of the awate.com website assumed this responsibility and breached the official silence on this matter. One question this raises, to my mind, is the extent to which Western governments, and indeed the U.S. government, posed by Awate webmasters as the model via the quotes from Major Giuliani on the 9/11 casualties and references to the Vietnam Memorial in D.C., to the extent that the U.S. indeed serves as a model for paying appropriate respect to citizens whose lives have been lost for national causes. The Bush era, Bush #1 that is, prohibition on publicizing the return of American bodies from the First Gulf War, was a bald attempt to cover up the extent of our losses and to stem national grief that could erode public support for the war effort and morph into condemnation and protest. Sustained for 18 years through the Clinton administration and through the second Bush administration, the ban was only lifted 2 years ago by President Obama, who restored press access to the ceremonies performed for returned bodies at Dover Air Force Base in Delaware. Hence, American infopolitics are also highly contested and not quite the idyllic model of transparency that Eritrean diasporic representations would have it. Still, everything's relative, and in the face of the official silences on the border war casualties, websites like awate.com press for accountability and data when denied it, and take it upon themselves to produce it. What would also be interesting to know is how the interactive nature of the internet might be employed to this purpose. In other words, beyond presumably leaked government reports on the casualties, do the Awate website managers solicit Eritreans at home and abroad to submit the names of their deceased loved ones? And she does say that amongst themselves, they do indicate that our kin, we checked the lists and for our kin. But beyond that immediate net of the team of the awate.com, is there an evocation to Eritreans both at home and abroad to submit the names of those they lost in the border war? This would be something interesting to pursue and would lend added import to Bernal's argument that, quote, the transformative power of the internet is not that it allows access to information, but rather that it allows ordinary people to question official narratives. The relation of the state to these websites would be another avenue I would want more information on, if admittedly a difficult avenue of research to pursue. So in the Tanzanian diaspora websites that I'm familiar with here in the US, there is a widespread assumption that the Tanzanian government is monitoring the posts and keeping track of who says what. It may be hyperbole, but there's real fear among diasporans from Tanzania that criticism of the state can have real effects on loved ones back at home. Stories abound about Tanzanians who have been denied renewals of their passports or denied visitor visas for family members to come visit them here in the US. These are interpreted as bureaucratic punishment for outspoken criticism or perceived lack of loyalty to the state in choosing to settle permanently abroad. And so here we have a parallel to the corporate surveillance that is a concern for Western users of the internet with political surveillance back in Tanzania, and also clearly in the case of the previous talk by Gabrielle Coleman in the US as well. Perhaps the relation of the Tanzanian state to its diasporan community is more fraught than that of the Eritrean case, because it is less dependent on diasporic remittances than the Eritrean state. And one important point here is that there are various diasporas, even within African diasporas, those resulting from conflict and war, of which the Eritrean case is one, and then the more economic diasporas that Tanzania is more a part of. And because Tanzania has been a poor country for so long, it hasn't had a large influx of people to escape the country, unlike, say, Nigeria. So this begs the question in my mind as to what repercussions, if any, are experienced or feared for family members back in Eritrea from online acts of resistance. And when Bernal argues that these websites enable diasporan Eritreans to engage or actually communicate with government elites in Eritrea, what are the nature of these exchanges? Are they one way only? Do government elites respond? Do they rise to the bait? Do they contest the accusations or maintain other official silences? And another thing to be perhaps pursued is what is the nature of the relationship between government elites and diasporans? Again, I think the nature of the difference between how diasporian Eritreans came to the U.S. is part of the difference that I'm seeing from Tanzania, and insofar as many of the diasporans from Tanzania are tied kinship-wise to the government elites, because you could only get the money to leave by having been in a position of political prestige and power. I don't think that's quite as transferable to other forms of diaspora, especially in Eritrea and Sudan, Somalia, where war and conflict led to a mass exodus of people. So that relationship is surely going to be different. Finally, to what extent is the argument that the online diasporans assume stately responsibility more a case, as is argued later in the paper, of generating civil society, a transnational form of Eritrean civil society? If more the latter, does this temper the criticism one can read of the state in these websites and direct it instead to Eritrean citizenry who have not developed civil society forms? For instance, when the Awate website states that, quote, this kind of endeavor, namely the memorial, would normally be the affair of a nonpartisan and functioning Eritrean civil society to whom we would gladly yield respectfully, but there are none in Eritrea, who is being blamed for this state of affairs? Is it citizenry, or is it the state for disenabling the development of civil society? Bernal proves beyond doubt to my mind that the internet must be understood as culturally and politically situated, yet she also highlights, interestingly, the pervasiveness of formula and genre, drawing here on the work of Whitaker, who's written on Tamil.net, and how even radical voices of dissent tend to adopt very conventionalized rhetorical forms of journalism in the Tamil case, of nationalism in the Eritrean case, to make their cases. Here's something that the internet has facilitated: the worldwide dispersal of certain Western discursive forms that have come to convey legitimacy and professionalism. So just as cyberspace allows for political dissent and narrative experimentation, so too does it allow for the institutionalization of political power and standardization of narrative genre. In short, the possibilities remain both wide and narrow as is evidenced in the fine ethnographic work Bernal has presented here. Thank you.